Good afternoon. A Kentuckian by birth and choice, Amanda Higgins earned her PhD in American History at the University of Kentucky in 2013. She currently serves as the Community Engagement Administrator at the Kentucky Historical Society, where she oversees statewide outreach efforts and helps local history organizations achieve their goals. She works with Kentucky communities to help them use their history to meet the challenges they now face and the challenges they're going to face in the future. Her understanding of the not-so-distant past helps her to connect and build lasting relationships with people all across the Commonwealth. She lives in Lexington with her husband and 2 daughters. Please welcome Amanda Higgins. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here, and though Julie Sosky is not here, she is who invited me, and so I just want to say thanks to her and to all of you for having me here today. I was saying at the table that one of the things I admire most about Rotarians is your punctualness. So I will stay within those 20 minutes and hope to have a pretty robust conversation in those 20 minutes. A couple of things just quickly before I start talking. I am a historian of the not-so-distant past, so I'm trained in 20th century history and Kentucky history. But what I like about history is actually talking to folks, talking with folks, and not at folks. So I'm going to ask you all a couple of questions. You can shout at me, it's totally fine. I know it's sort of out of Rotarian decorum, but I'm going to ask you to just kind of hang out with me for a minute and have a conversation. What am I going to talk about today? A couple of things. We'll go over 3 sort of things that Julie told me that we like TED Talks. So I have loose notes, and we'll see what happens. Why me, and what am I doing here? So as Ashley said, I'm the Community Engagement Administrator at the Kentucky Historical Society. But what that really means is that I'm a hype girl for Kentucky history. Just out here trying to make sure that folks who love Kentucky history have access to it, that we're doing a good job when we're talking about Kentucky history, and that we're being inclusive when we're doing that. So one of the things that historians have grappled with for as long as history has been a profession is that we pick and choose who we talk about and what narratives we talk about, and that often leaves most of us out. And what I want to talk about today with you all is how we can do that better, how we can stop leaving people out, how we can tell them our different histories, and how you all, as both people who might be interested in history, as maybe local historians or somebody who's interested in your family history, and as visitors to historic sites. So almost everywhere you go in Louisville is connected to some part of the city's history. You can ask it questions. You can ask the folks their questions that help us tell these stories better. So how do we tell better inclusive histories? What is your role? And who and how do we celebrate while acknowledging these kind of tricky things? So, why history? In 2017, Reach Advisors, who are a research analyst group, found that history museums and historic sites are the most trusted sites for knowledge in the United States. That is a huge responsibility for us and means that we have to do better. In the time between, we've been overtaken by public libraries. Fair, public libraries are awesome. It still means that as these institutions, it is our responsibility and a huge opportunity to live up to the potential of being a trusted site. When we don't do that, we lose that trust in a time when people are struggling with where do I find truth, what can I believe, how do I ask these questions? And so as the Kentucky Historical Society, as historic sites, it's my responsibility in working with historic sites across the Commonwealth. I like to start here and say, people trust you. That's awesome. Let's use that trust to talk a little bit more to make sure that they can continue to trust you and that you're doing due diligence. This year, 2020, is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. White people are given earn the right to vote. It is also the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which ensures that African American women can vote, and the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, which made the 15th Amendment a reality for all people, Black people across the South and the United States. Those are huge commemorative moments. They're a big deal. They expanded democracy. It's something that historic sites are celebrating across the year. it also is an opportunity to do more. So you may have seen, especially this month of the Women's History Month, a lot about the 19th Amendment. Has anybody been seeing stuff about the 19th? A little bit, yeah. Have you seen this picture? No. Many times. What is this picture? It is not Seneca Falls, but that's a good guess. It does. This is Governor Edwin Morrow of Kentucky and the Kentucky Equal Rights Association when he is signing Kentucky's ratification of the 19th Amendment. So this is kind of the most famous image of Kentuckians and the 19th Amendment. We have, over here in the corner is Laura Clay, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, and a number of other Kentucky luminaries. Who do you see in this picture? Tell me about these people. You can guess, it's a little fortunate. They're a women's club, they're older. They're white women. Yes, very good. This is the story of the 19th Amendment in Kentucky as a big narrative. That it was older white women who worked diligently for many years to expand the electorate. And that's very true. It also is not the full story. But we picked this image because it's got a governor. We're doing it before states we don't like Tennessee. We do. Tennessee's the state that gets it onto the Constitution for the last to ratify it. The last two to ratify it. These are women we know. Laura Clay is very famous. So we feel good about this image. But if this is the only image we get, then we walk away with a specific narrative of who was involved and who did the work. That's not what we want to do as nuanced historians in moments of historic sites. I will say that a group of folks here in Louisville and throughout the state are trying to identify everyone in this image so we can know a little bit more about them. We know the very famous faces, but we don't know everyone in this image. We don't know their involvement. Were they just there because they liked Morrow? Who is this young man in the corner? We don't know those sorts of things. And one of the things that this group is using the 19th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to do is to tell that fuller story. So there's an opportunity for that. Has anyone seen an image like this? And yes, so it is from Kentucky. It is the capital, yeah. This is the 1964 March on Frankfurt. The March on Frankfurt was led by Martin Luther King, was organized by Frank Stanley of Louisville, and involved Georgia Davis Powers. It was for open accommodations and to push the governor at the time to do more for civil rights in Kentucky. When it celebrated its 50, there was a commemorative march. And I picked this image because it's a contrast to the 1920 image. And it doesn't tell a full story either. So we have a bunch of folks outside the Capitol marching to pressure the governor at the time to pass an accommodations bill in a place, in a state that often saw itself as being more inclusive, as not needing an accommodations bill because we didn't have deep-seated Jim Crow, folks could vote, those sorts of things. But this happened and it mattered, and it's something that we don't talk a lot about, and we don't do a very good job of engaging with. And this picture particularly I like, because we have state troopers in the foreground. There are lots and lots of people, but just like that picture of Morrow and the women at the signing of the 19th, we don't know a lot about it. And you can walk away with a certain image. Younger people, we have one sign that says Civil Rights Now, but we don't know a lot of what's going on. And we don't know about George Davis Powers and Frank Stanley, who were there, who did the work of building the community. And when we talk about the March on Frankfurt, we often don't talk about that. George Davis Powers is our first elected female state senator, our first African American in the Senate. She right out of Louisville for that election. And she got started in organizing with Frank Stanley and trying to do that. And actually it's kind of the backbone of doing this work. But when we talk about the March on Frankfurt, it's usually Dr. King was in Frankfurt. and Jackie Robinson was in Frankfurt, and we kind of erased or silenced the local on-the-ground work. And one of the things that I think is really powerful and something that we, as individuals and as doing more inclusive history, can do is talk about the people involved and talk about it beyond these very famous people and how it took place. So these are two kind of examples of that. What is your role as a visitor? It's asking those sorts of questions and engaging with that material. It is asking and expecting a little bit more nuance when you go into places that are doing this kind of commemorative work. It is great to commemorate, it's important, we need to connect that. It is also important that we're doing it in a really truthful way, because again, historic sites are some of the most trusted places in the country. We need to do it well. So, how do we do it? How do you acknowledge a biography? How do you commemorate someone who did something great, who is also problematic? Which is what we all are, right? We all are nuanced, we all have lots of different ways that we engage with the world. And it matters that we hold people accountable in the historical record for both their great and their questionable. So I want to show you how to do that in a way that we can acknowledge and celebrate and still hold a nuance. And I'm going to do it through two women. On your are my left. Not historian, not good women. Over here, the older woman is Laura Clay. What do you know about Laura Clay? Nothing. Interesting. She is related to Henry. She is a niece of Henry. She's Cassius Clay's daughter. Anything else? That's okay. Lots of people only know Laura Clay because she's a Clay. But why she matters for what I'm going to tell you right now is that she was the founder of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. She was heavily involved for a little while in trying to get a statewide vote for women, for white women. So in this year, Laura Clay is being held up as this great Kentuckian who did these wonderful things by helping to get the 19th Amendment passed, helping to work to expand the electorate. Laura Clay is also problematic in a 21st century view. And this is because she didn't actually want a national amendment. She wanted to work state by state. And she believed that states' rights, in southern states particularly, to write voting laws that enfranchise certain folks, but not all folks. So that white women could vote, but not women of color. She was anti the federal amendment because it was against states' rights. She believed very deeply in this idea of local control and local government. That's who she was. We can hold both of those truths, that she worked for an expansion of the electorate and that came with limitations, certain people. She went on to found the Democratic Women's Club of Kentucky, which still exists today. She lived until 1941 and remained an active participant in society. But holding that nuance matters because it makes more room for understanding how people worked and how they did it. It makes more room for asking questions. In Kentucky, we're all Kentuckians fighting for a statewide or a national amendment, or were they thinking about this in political terms, in terms for what would benefit them? You can ask those questions, and you should when you go into these spaces, because then you are able to gain a little bit more, to learn a little bit more, and to say, we know this, what don't we know? Who else isn't doing this? Over here, we have Emma Guy Cromwell. Anyone heard of Emma Guy? You're going to learn a little something too, even as I'm telling you. Emma Guy Cromwell was the first statewide official, female statewide official in Kentucky. She's born in western Kentucky, southwestern Kentucky, ends up an orphan. She has kind of a very tragic background. In the 1890s, she is appointed as the state librarian. So she becomes the first person, first woman to hold that position in the first statewide office. She's actually best known as a parliamentarian. So she was a parliamentarian of the House and the Senate, and she wrote this very famous book in 1918 about parliamentary procedure that is still used today in the state house. So she did some pretty incredible things. she is often held up as this woman that we should be celebrating because she had this appointed position. She also wins a seat as a state treasurer in the 1920s and is the director of state parks. We mentioned state parks earlier, so she is a part of that in 1932. She is often presented as very uncomplicated because this is the historian. This is what happens in history. We tell narratives and then we edit narratives and then we edit them again and we edit them again and then all of a sudden we've got a new story. In the 1990s, the Kentucky Commission on Women republished Emma Guy Cromwell's autobiography. She wrote an autobiography in like 1935 where she used racial and racist language. She described folks in words that we would not use today and that are frankly awful. In choosing to republish her biography, the commission chose to edit that out, which is their choice. That's what historians do. You make a choice in a narrative. But now, when you publish that, when you pull that to learn about Emma Guy Cromwell, you're pulling the 1990s version, not her version. And so even the Historical Society, has used Cromwell's 1990s autobiography and told her story without telling it as a more complicated story. And we've let that slide. And that's on us as historians, as places that are seen as a truthful place. And it's also on our constituents and our friends for not holding us accountable for that. And that's what I'm charging you with today, is holding folks accountable and holding these two truths together. Emma Guy Cromwell and Laura Clay did great things for the Commonwealth. They also did things that benefited themselves and that benefited a view that they had that we don't hold today. And we can hold those two truths. We can work with them. We can figure out how to have a nuanced conversation around history that also informs what we're talking about today. We can hold those two truths together and we can ground them in history. So, what again is your role? Ask and engage and hold folks accountable because we want to be held accountable. You can also donate and support historic sites doing good work. Help us do good work because it does take time to do that. And when sites are attacked or seen as erasing history, you can help support those sites by supporting them, by talking with them. You all are movers and shakers, you have businesses. You can say, we're going to visit this and see what it is before we react. We're going to continue to work with this place because we believe in the work that they're doing. Or we're not going to work with this place because we don't believe that they're living in those standards. And that's great. That's what we need as cultural sites, as sites of trust. We need to be trusted with that and supported in making that case. Now, I don't want to leave you on a downer. Historians are typically like that. We're like, it's all awful. It's always been awful. That's not me. It's not all awful. There's great work happening. It is a great era of commemoration, and it's important that as we commemorate, we're doing it well. So I want to give you a couple of examples of places that are doing this well and that you can support. Here in Louisville, the Fraser History Museum will be opening a new exhibit on March 19th called What is a Vote Worth? They've been planning this for about a year. It's going to run for a year. It's looking at suffrage wider than just the 19th Amendment. It's asking these same sorts of questions. They're also using some Kentucky Historical Society materials, so I feel like I have to say that, look for our stuff. The Filson Historical Society will also be opening an exhibit that looks beyond the 19th Amendment called Women at Work, Venturing into the Public Sphere. That opens on March 13th and is based in their collections, but a lot of it is based on some really incredible dresses. So if you're interested in material culture, that's a great place to be. The Filson and Fraser are doing great work to tell Kentucky stories and Louisville stories, so supporting them is something that I recommend. I also want to highlight Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate in Lexington. This is a very traditional house museum. So if you think about like your grandma's house tour, that like she drug you on when you were 12 and it was awful, that was Ashland for a while. They are now not doing that, which is awesome and why you should support them. They were funded through a grant program that the Kentucky Historical Society runs called the Local History Trust Fund to explore the experiences of the enslaved at Ashland, folks who Henry Clay and his family owned. They have a new tour that runs on Tuesdays and Thursdays called Traces, the Enslaved at Ashland, where they look at, this tour you will look at the experiences of the enslaved at Ashland through resistance and resilience. It's wonderful. They're also doing a Women of Ashland tour, which focuses on all of the women, but particularly right now they're looking at Madeline McDowell Breckenridge, who is a Clay descendant and somehow related to Laura. And I don't know, the Clays like do this, and it's very confusing. But she was a leader of the women's suffrage movement and actually was much more on the side of a national minute. So the Clays in their own family can hold these things together. Nationally, there are a couple of ways that you can get involved and places you can go. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is actually calling on folks to submit sites that are underserved and underrepresented at the moment around women's history. So sites of women's empowerment, women's change, you can do that through their website. This is their hashtag Tell the Full Story, and they're hoping to gather about 1,000 sites of women's empowerment across the country. Here in Louisville, there are many sites that could fit for that and should be considered. And then lastly, I just want to highlight the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in Washington. It has been open for a couple of years, but it does this at the highest level, what I'm talking about, asking questions of inclusivity, asking about how you can think of things in a nuanced way and deal with that. The new president of the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, honestly birthed this in his brain and saw it all the way through to being open. He's now the Secretary of the Smithsonian and is asking that all Smithsonian sites start thinking this way. So you're going to see this as you visit museums really being the way that we start engaging and moving away from these large Uber narratives tied around very specific people and more into how all of us are involved in this and how all of us can hold multiple truths together. This is the work that I think is worth doing. It is the work that I hope you will join us in doing and join your cultural sites in doing and being a part of. And it's not exactly what Julie Sosky asked me to do, but it is what I'm glad to be here to talk to you all about. And I did it in 20 minutes. Woo! So I'm happy to take questions, talk about the Historical Society, talk about this a little deeper, or to get out of your way. Because I know time is important. I'll repeat for anybody who can't hear.
I'm just curious, we've got a lot of debate with some of these statues and continued building on some that are still up. So what are your thoughts on, there's some good and there's some bad, and how do we organize that?
Yeah, so the question was about the statues, and I assume we're talking specifically about Confederate statues and commemoration. So we at the Historical Society, and me personally, have been thinking about this pretty deeply for a while, and as a Kentuckian and just Mandy Higgins, not the Historical Society, which is hard to pull together, I would like to see them come down, just as an individual in the state. As a historian, I think most historians are at the point of wanting them to come down as well, because they are not good history. They're not commemorative. They tell a glorified narrative that doesn't always gel with what we know about history. I think really it's about, I'm going to quote Laura Clay now, even though I just told you to hold multiple truths. It's about local control. It is a city's decision if they want to keep commemoration up, keep these commemorative Confederate statues up, and how they want to deal with that. If you choose as a Louisville community that these should stay, then I can't tell you not to. But it's a conversation that each locality has to have, and to make space for multiple voices, for the voices of people who feel marginalized and oppressed by the presence of these statues, as well as people who are deeply tied to the histories that statue is telling, and then to decide and have a strong decision in that. So I live in Lexington. Mayor Gray in 2017 decided to remove two Confederate statues from our historic court lawn after hearing a lot of debate. And he found a lot of support and some pushback, and that was his choice and the city's choice, and I think that's fine.
Neville Blakemore. Follow up on that, a little bit of context. My mother's mother, she grew up in Petersburg. For all of you know, it was the longest siege of the Civil War, and growing up with my grandmother, that was spoon-fed to me. And I've since learned about organizations like Daughters of the Confederacy, which really sort of created this whole nostalgic view. And my grandmother was in her teens before she realized the South actually lost the war.
Yeah.
Yes. And the whole living flag and stuff like this.
Right.
So my question is, organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy, which are regional organizations and really strong, really well funded, and creating that kind of narrative, do we have equivalency organizations today? I agree with your overall point about sort of local control and taking out the sort of, it's a more nuanced view of history. But I'm curious, I always thought my grandmother just sort of grew up that way on, sort of by accident, but it was clearly very intentional, very well orchestrated, and highly effective. So are there equivalencies of the Daughters of the Confederacy today?
Well, the Daughters still exist today. So, yes, the Daughters. And they're still doing the same, they still are active in commemoration, they're active in, I mean, many of them are older, frankly. But they show up, so for example, the Jefferson Davis statue that's in the state capitol is under a lot of debate at the moment. And the members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans show up to protect Davis when there are conversations about this. And, that's their right to do that. As for kind of shaping narratives in a concerted effort in the way that the Daughters did, I don't feel comfortable in saying that there's someone equivalent. As the Daughters gained strength in the 1880s, 1890s, professional historians didn't exist as a profession yet. It's not until the early 20th century that history becomes professionalized. But the Daughters' greatest success was getting their narrative into state textbooks. That's why your grandmother grew up with that thought, because the textbooks were that way. And so there are groups like a group called Teaching Tolerance, who's part of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who works to provide educators with ways to tell and do more inclusive work in their classrooms, and to undo some of those narratives that they're getting in textbooks with other sorts of materials. But in a concerted effort in the way that the UDC does it, I don't really feel comfortable in saying that there's a equivalent today beyond them still existing.
Amanda, I'm Tom Boner. Excuse me. And from my 2020 perspective, I was surprised to hear what you said about Laura Clay and being against an amendment that seems so obvious.
Right.
So it makes me wonder, were there other minority perspectives again, besides her states' rights perspective?
So Clay's states' rights perspective is pretty standard. I should say, and a failure of this for me in 20 minutes is including the voices of non-white women in telling this story. So someone like Nanny Helen Burroughs, who will have a historical marker dedicated here on March 31st, worked to expand this as a federal amendment that also included teeth to make the 15th Amendment real as well. So often, there were like 3 national segments of the women's suffrage. The largest, the National Women's Suffrage Association, which pushed for a federal amendment. The Southern States Women's Suffrage Association, I think that's right, I have it before. Southern States Women's Suffrage Association, which pushed for local control for states' rights and was very anti a federal amendment. And then an active and associated African American women's group through Black women's clubs that pushed for a federal amendment that included race as well and had teeth to make sure that Black women could vote. Often there's also, and this is something that, as like a feminist and a scholar, I don't love, but there were lots of women who didn't think women should vote at all and were anti-suffrage and worked against the amendment at all, against the idea of states' rights against women voting, because, we're silly, and we can't have the responsibility to vote, and we'll vote dumb, and we should just be at home with, like, our kids and stuff. We shouldn't be doing anything else. It's true, those were the arguments. So there are those rights. And I will say, often, historians, even as I'm telling you to be inclusive, historians want champion narratives. We want to be really proud, we want to talk about positives, it's just hard. And then when it goes against something like today, 100 years back, looking in 2020, to have to think about anti-suffrage, to think about women not wanting the right to vote, with a bunch of people who were educated and kind of told to be civically active and told that our jobs were to help people be civically active, that's really hard to hold. So I would say we're actually doing a really bad job of including that counter argument about suffrage at the moment, because we want to be positive right now.
I mean, I'm not older with the United Way. So as I'm hearing you, I'm thinking about Kentucky Historical Society, which is connected to the state government, correct?
We are.
Wondering and thinking also about national park system and how these are connected to our government. And I'm wondering, because of how politicized things are today, what kind of protections are in place for organizations like the Historical Society, the Smithsonian, the National Parks, and how often does the narrative change because of the winds of politics? And what kind of separation systems exist or don't exist to help us deal with this narrative and then the politicized narrative?
That's a great question. And I'm going to be depressing. So the Kentucky Historical Society is administratively attached to the Tourism, Arts, and Heritage Cabinet of state government, which means that we are in the executive branch, but we are not appointed employees. We have a separate board, a governing board, who oversees our work, that is not appointed by the governor, though the governor has a position as an ex officio on that board. Protection, in the sense of if we did something that, say, the governor didn't like, it depends. The worst that could happen to us is that we lose our appropriation, which would be devastating, because 65% of our budget comes from the state, from the legislature. And state societies that are attached to their legislature are being threatened this way. The Minnesota Historical Society, for example, was threatened to lose something like $12 million a year for choosing to call a Civil War fort by its indigenous name and not by the name that white folks called it. So in doing inclusive history, they ran the risk of losing a large chunk of their budget. So that happens. Your question about how often does it change in the winds? Federally, not as much, though federal appropriations also go through this and have the problem in the last 4 years. The federal organizations like the Smithsonian, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, Institute for Museum and Library Services have seen the current administration cut their budgets to zero, item them out to zero in the proposed budget. It has come back in. So that has not happened, which is good for the infrastructure of culture across this country. But it is required that when you get those grants, when you do that work, that you do it non-politically. And so people are taking a lot of time to think about what that means and what choices to make. You can see that if you saw, the 1st of February when the National Archives opened a new exhibit about protests in the 19th Amendment, and they included an image from the First Women's March where they blurred out anti-Trump signs and signs that were deemed offensive. They got massive blowback from their constituents, particularly from the historical community and archivists who were up in arms that the National Archives would edit an image to potentially protect the feelings of an administrator. And that is kind of how they chose it. They ended up taking it down and fixing it. And it was because they were held accountable for that action that it was called out and what I would say fixed and being accurate to the historical record. But it was a choice that every institution has to make if they're willing to potentially lose funding, to go against power, or to not. And that's something as visitors you have to think about too. And that's a lot to ask a visitor to know where funding comes from and how the attachment is. I would assume lots of you don't know that the Historical Society is state government, right? Like, I often have to say, we're state government. But if we're honest with our visitors, if we say, you're right, this could have gone further, but we are not comfortable or protected enough to do that, we ask you to do that work, then I think we can have a really powerful conversation. And we hope that our national institutions hold us and provide us best practices in doing that. When I go out to local communities and talk with them, I always say, you have to be aware of your community and what you can do and what you can sustain as an organization. Make those choices informed, and then have an answer when people ask. Don't get caught flat-footed. And that's what happened in Narra. They were caught flat-footed.
Dan Hartledge, first of all, the information you're conveying and your actual presentation, the way you're conveying it is outstanding. It's very good. Thank you. Now that we have the cheap applause out there, I'll try to make this a short, less than 5-minute question. But just moments before I came in, I saw Elizabeth Warren drop out.
Yeah.
The race. And I don't know, it's kind of just made me think a little bit. 100 years ago, 1920, women's suffrage, I guess in about 1983, we had a woman governor. 63 years later, that's not bad, 63 years later. But so 2 questions, I'm not sure if you can expound on this or not. Number one, have women come that far politically in terms of running and being elected, or have they not? Is, I guess, one question. The other question is, within the Kentucky Historical Society, do you have information on other women, the trailblazers who actually have been elected to office in Kentucky?
Yeah, so we do have some information. A lot of that is actually in the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, which is another state organization whose whole job is to hold government records. So if you want to learn about Martha Lane Collins, our first and to the state only female governor, you can go to the KDLA in Frankfurt and see her archives, and also come to us because we have like her desk set, which is really interesting. I'll tell you about in a minute to answer the second question about how far we've come. But yes, there are a number of women who've held elected offices in Kentucky. We have had federally elected women in the House, but not a senator. And Kentuckians have held federal positions, including Elaine Chao. Even if they weren't elected, they're holding federal political power. Have Kentucky, or have women gained political power? If we're comparing from 1920, absolutely. There are senators, there are governors, there are local leaders. My town has I live in Lexington, we have a female mayor, not the first one. To quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is there equity or equality? Well, there are not 12 women on the Supreme Court, right? You cannot deny that there has been progress because women are holding office. We've had, in this election cycle, you had multiple women on that debate stage. You had women winning delegates, both very progressive women and more of a centrist woman, Amy Klobuchar. Is it also, we still don't have a female president. I don't know when we will. I believe we will at some point, but I don't know when. We haven't even had a female vice president. So there feels like there are still ceilings, and that equity and equality has not fully been reached yet. It is definitely a harder climb for women into the political sphere, and we can see that historically. So women are running for the presidency before they can vote. Women in Kentucky are running for the presidency before women can vote. Josephine Henry, who's from Versailles, was on a ticket for a third party in 1912, maybe, something like that. So in the last, to look in the last, say, 8 years, we see, 12 years, I guess now, women holding major sway in politics, gaining platforms of, Hillary Clinton ran and won the popular vote. So there are people who are looking for this, but we haven't gotten there yet, and it's a harder one. It's held differently It just is. The expectations are different. The ways that women are to act in public are still different. And as we try to, again, to tie this to history, to tell more inclusive stories, that means that they're also engaging, as we as historians engage with them, engaging with them differently, because either we're giving them slack where maybe they don't deserve it because we're saying, oh, well, they were a woman, so it was harder, so maybe they wouldn't take hard stands, and they should have dropped out. Or we are holding them to this level of perfection that's just not possible because we are still part of the society, and we are still engaging in that way. So, get your daughters to run. Support strong women. But really, I think it's more acknowledging that there has been, one of the things that I think historians are really bad about is being doom and gloom and saying it's not good enough and we haven't come far enough and there hasn't been progress. But history looks like this, not like this. And so sometimes that progress means that you're going in circles for a little bit until you can jump to the next level. 1965 was jumping to the next level. Because now our Constitution, what we did in 1865, had teeth and was enforceable through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. For our LGBTQ plus friends, talking the Supreme Court decision about marriage equality is that jump, right? It's living that more perfect union. For women, that jump happened in 1920. Maybe it also happened in the 60s and 70s revolution. It potentially happens if we can actually have the ERA signed onto the Constitution, even though it's fallen out. But Virginia ratified. That was the last state that was needed. And maybe that step is that we're going to sit like this for a while, where we have powerful senators, where we have strong people who are voiced and politically active, but we don't have the same power. And then in 2024 or 2028 or 2032, or when my daughter in 2054 is President Aurora Higgins, then we get that. And she won't be, and she should not be. But we could get there. Because we don't know, historians don't know the future. We only know the past. And everything is contingent on the next step. Y'all are awesome.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That was a terrific presentation. This state has such a rich history, and there's so much to learn. On a personal note, I had the pleasure when I started lobbying for the General Assembly many years ago. I had the pleasure of calling on Senator Georgia Davis Powers. She was a true icon and a real leader of the state. So I'm glad she brought that into the presentation. Let's give Amanda one more round of applause. Okay, two quick reminders. Next week we'll be back here at the Waterfront Botanical Gardens for our Thursday meeting. And then lastly, if you're interested in learning more about Rotary, please see Craig Sherman at the back of the room for the What is Rotary table. And with that, we are adjourned.